I never imagined that a simple call from my boss's assistant would open the door to one of the most honest, disarming conversations of my life. What he revealed in that quiet office changed how I saw my work, my choices, and even myself. Before I begin, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please remember to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. The whole thing began on a cool Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun takes its time warming the streets and everyone still carries a bit of weekend heaviness in their shoulders. I had just settled into my cubicle with a mug of lukewarm coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel, my boss's assistant. Steady voice, steady presence, never one to call unless something needed attention. "Could you come to the main office when you have a moment?" he asked. His tone wasn't urgent, but it carried a quiet weight, the kind that makes you sit up straighter without knowing why. I'm a woman in my mid-50s, and I've been in this company long enough to know that unexpected calls to the top floor usually mean one of two things: a big project or a big problem. On the walk there, I tried to convince myself it would be the former. The hallway felt longer than usual, the beige walls humming with the soft echo of printers, tapping keyboards, and distant conversations. Everything seemed normal, but inside I felt a subtle flutter, that tiny twist in the stomach you get when something is about to shift. When I reached the glass door of my boss's suite, I noticed it was only half open. Inside, the lights were dimmer than usual, just the soft glow from the tall window and a desk lamp casting a warm circle across the room. My boss wasn't there. Instead, Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot as if he were rehearsing something. He turned toward me, and for a moment, he just smiled in that polite, steady way he always did. But there was something different in his eyes, something more thoughtful, almost cautious. "Thank you for coming," he said gently. He motioned toward the chair in front of the desk. I sat, placing my hands in my lap to keep them from fidgeting. He walked around the desk but didn't sit. He leaned lightly against the edge, as if he needed to stay grounded. That was when I sensed this wasn't about paperwork or schedules. There was a quiet sincerity in the air, a stillness that made me more aware of my breathing, of the space between us, of the faint ticking of the wall clock. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he began, "and I hope you don't mind that I asked you privately." His voice carried no tension, no discomfort, just honesty. Real, plain honesty. The kind we forget people are capable of in an office environment full of hurried conversations and half-finished thoughts. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. He continued, choosing his words with care. "I've noticed the way you take on everything. Every task, every expectation, without ever letting on when it's too much. You've been carrying more than anyone realizes." He paused, letting his words settle. "And I think it's time someone acknowledged that. I wasn't expecting that. Not even close." A warmth rose in my face, the kind that comes from being seen, really seen, after years of trying to blend into the background to keep everything running smoothly. I swallowed, reminding myself to stay composed. Daniel stepped a little closer, not in a bold way, but in a way that felt respectful, almost protective. "You deserve more support," he said, "more recognition, more understanding." His words weren't dramatic, but they reached somewhere deep inside me, touching the part of myself I tended to push aside for the sake of being reliable, steady, and quiet. I took a breath and finally found my voice. "I didn't realize anyone noticed." "I did," he replied softly, "and I thought you should know." The room felt warmer suddenly, filled with a quiet, shared acknowledgement. The distance between us wasn't uncomfortable. It simply felt real, honest, human. And as I sat there, looking at him in that softly lit office with the world carrying on outside, I sensed that this conversation was only the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, but was finally ready to face. On my way back to my cubicle after that conversation, the office looked strangely different, as though someone had quietly adjusted the lighting or rearranged the air itself. People moved around me in their usual rhythm, carrying files, sipping from travel mugs, chatting about weekend errands, but I felt like I was walking through a softer version of the morning I'd started with. Something inside me had shifted, even if no one else could see it. I sat down and tried to lose myself in my daily tasks, but my thoughts kept circling back to Daniel's voice, the steadiness of it, the sincerity in every word he'd said. It wasn't dramatic or grand. It was honest, warm, and unexpectedly comforting. I'd spent years building walls made of responsibility and quiet resilience, and in a matter of minutes, he had managed to tap gently on them, just enough for me to notice how heavy they had become. A couple of hours passed before I saw him again. He appeared beside my cubicle with that calm expression he always wore, though now I felt as if I understood him a bit better. He didn't interrupt me right away. He waited, hands lightly in his pockets, giving me time to finish typing a sentence before I turned to him. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his tone soft enough that only I could hear. I nodded, standing before I could overthink it. We walked to the small break room at the end of the hall. It was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of someone's radio playing from a far-off workstation. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, calm stripes across the table. Daniel took the chair opposite mine, leaning forward with his forearms resting on the tabletop in a way that made the conversation feel more personal than formal. "I wanted to make sure I didn't overwhelm you earlier," he said. "I know it was a lot." His concern caught me off guard. Not many people in the office, maybe not many people in my life, paused long enough to check how I was feeling, at least not in a way that encouraged honesty. The thought softened something inside me. "It wasn't overwhelming," I said. "Just unexpected. I'm not used to people being that direct about noticing me." He smiled, not widely, but with a kind of quiet warmth that said he understood more than he let on. "Sometimes noticing is the easiest part," he said. "Saying something is the harder step." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and for a moment we simply sat there in that golden afternoon light, the comfortable silence settling around us. There was no pressure, no quick decisions to make, just two people sharing a moment that felt strangely grounding. He looked at me again, more thoughtfully this time. "I hope you know that what I said wasn't just about work," he added. "It was about you, about the way you carry yourself, the way you take care of everyone else before ever stopping to think about yourself." His words struck deeper than he probably realized. I had lived a long life with many responsibilities, family, aging parents, relationships that didn't end the way I once imagined. Somewhere along the way, I had learned to survive by staying steady and quiet, telling myself that my feelings were less important than the tasks in front of me. Hearing someone acknowledge that without judgment, it felt like he'd opened a window I didn't know the room needed. "I suppose I never thought anyone was paying attention," I said quietly. He shook his head. "I was. Maybe more than you realize." Those words lingered between us, gentle but powerful, creating a subtle tension, not sharp or dramatic, but the kind that comes from being genuinely understood by someone you didn't expect. I looked at him, noticing the small things, the way he kept his voice calm but sincere, the way he tilted his head slightly when listening, the way he held himself with careful respect, as if he knew every conversation mattered. It wasn't romantic tension. It was emotional clarity, a connection forming slowly and naturally, like a sunrise easing across a dark sky. He leaned back a little, giving me space. "If you ever want to talk, about work or anything else, I'd like to be someone you can come to." It was such a simple offer, yet it carried a depth that made my chest feel warmer. It had been a long time since anyone had said something like that without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it more than he could know. The rest of the day passed quietly, but with a different rhythm than before. Every time I looked toward the main office, I felt a small reminder of the conversation we'd shared. Not a weight, not a distraction, something closer to reassurance. A reminder that even in a place as ordinary as an office building, unexpected moments of truth can slip into your life and change the way you see yourself. By the time the sun dipped low and the office lights flickered on overhead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Not for drama, not for anything unpredictable, but for clarity, for connection, for whatever this new understanding between us might become. When I gathered my things and walked toward the elevator, I saw Daniel down the hall, finishing up some notes at the reception counter. He looked up just as I passed, offering a warm, brief smile that felt like the close of a new beginning. And somehow, I knew the next day would bring something more. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I told myself it was because I had a full workload and wanted a head start, but deep down, I knew I was carrying a quiet curiosity about how the day might unfold. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting soft blue and gold streaks across the windows as I walked inside. The building was peaceful at that hour, almost reflective, the kind of stillness that makes your thoughts sound louder. I placed my bag under my desk and took a slow breath, feeling the calm before the daily rush began. I didn't expect to see anyone else so early, but as I turned toward the break room to make fresh coffee, I saw Daniel standing near the counter, pouring hot water into a mug. He looked slightly surprised to see me, but in a warm, unmistakably pleasant way. "You're here early," he said, offering that gentle smile he seemed to save for moments that mattered. "So are you," I replied, reaching for a clean cup. "Long day ahead?" He shook his head lightly. "Just wanted some quiet before everything begins." There was a short pause, not awkward, just thoughtful. The morning light came through the window, catching the edges of his hair and highlighting the calmness on his face. He looked more relaxed than he usually did during the bustle of office hours. There was something settling about seeing him that way, unhurried, sincere, and grounded. We both reached for the sugar at the same moment. Instead of a clumsy scramble or an embarrassed laugh, we simply pulled back at the same time, almost in sync, as if we'd rehearsed it. And somehow, that small, ordinary gesture carried a quiet connection, the kind that reveals understanding without needing big words. "You can take it," I said softly. He shook his head. "Go ahead. I'm good." I stirred my coffee slowly, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there in the soft glow of the early morning, listening to the faint hum of the building waking up. Finally, Daniel's voice broke the silence in a gentle, thoughtful way. "I was hoping we could continue our conversation from yesterday," he said, "but only if you're comfortable with that." I nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to say yes. "I am." He motioned toward the small table in the corner. We both sat down, each of us settling into a calm, easy rhythm. He didn't rush into anything. Instead, he gave me time, which told me that whatever he wanted to say wasn't meant to push or pressure. It was meant to understand. "I've been thinking a lot about what you shared yesterday," he began. "About how you've been handling everything on your own for so long. I hope you know that you don't have to keep doing that." His words touched something deep again, the same way they had the day before. I looked down at my coffee, feeling an unexpected warmth rise inside me, not discomfort, but a quiet recognition. "I think I got used to not expecting anyone to notice," I said. "Life has a way of teaching you that if you don't take care of things yourself, they won't get done." He leaned forward slightly, not in an assertive way, but with genuine attentiveness. "But who takes care of you?" The question left me still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't invasive. It was simply true, and I hadn't allowed myself to think about it in years. I looked up and met his eyes. They were steady, calm, thoughtful, without judgment, without assumptions. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he cared about the answer. "I'm still figuring that out," I said honestly. "Then maybe," he replied softly, "you don't have to figure it out alone." Something shifted inside me again, subtle, warm, and deeply human. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was something meaningful, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a very long time. The hallway began to fill with footsteps and soft voices as more employees arrived, but the moment between us didn't break. If anything, it settled more comfortably into the space, grounding itself in the reality of a new day. Before we stood up to join the rest of the office, he added, "I want you to know that I admire the way you've carried yourself. Your strength, your patience, the way you handle everything. It leaves an impression, a real one." I didn't know what to say at first. No one had spoken to me like that in years, not with admiration that wasn't tied to a favor or an expectation, not with kindness that didn't feel performative or fleeting. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I didn't realize it showed." "It does," he said. "More than you think." We walked out of the break room together, side by side. The noise of the morning routine grew around us, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, coworkers greeting each other. But for the first time in a long while, those familiar sounds didn't feel overwhelming. They felt manageable, maybe even reassuring. And as I settled back into my desk, I realized something important. What was happening between Daniel and me wasn't about sudden emotion or dramatic revelation. It was about understanding, about being recognized, about two people finding clarity in a place where most people only look for routine. The rest of the morning passed with a subtle sense of anticipation. Not nerves, just the warm awareness that something meaningful had begun. Something respectful, steady, and deeply honest. Something I hadn't expected but was slowly learning to welcome. The next few days at work carried a quiet rhythm, different from anything I had experienced before. There was no fanfare, no extraordinary gestures, just a steady, genuine presence that shifted the way I viewed my days. Daniel and I didn't need to announce anything. The change was subtle, yet unmistakable. He would check in on me with a simple, thoughtful question, and I would feel seen. I realized that these moments, small as they were, carried far more weight than anything dramatic ever could. One afternoon, a project came up that required both of us to collaborate closely. We found ourselves in a conference room with papers and charts spread across the table, sunlight streaming in through the tall windows. I noticed how naturally our working styles complemented each other. He had a calm decisiveness, and I had a thoroughness that kept us balanced. It was the kind of teamwork that didn't just get the job done, but made the process meaningful. At one point, while reviewing a particularly tricky set of numbers, he paused and looked at me. "I appreciate the way you handle these details," he said simply. "You make things easier for everyone without ever complaining. That's rare." I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from pride, but from something deeper, acknowledgement. "Thank you," I replied. "It's nice to hear someone notice that." He smiled softly. "I notice," he said. We returned to our work, but there was a quiet connection lingering, like a thread woven into the fabric of the room itself. I found myself reflecting on how unusual it was to be in a professional space where honesty and respect weren't just words, but actions you could feel. Later that evening, as the office began to empty and the soft hum of the ventilation system replaced the usual chatter, I found myself lingering at my desk. Daniel approached, holding 2 cups of tea he must have brought from the small cafe downstairs. He offered one to me with that same calm attentiveness, and I accepted, feeling a warm gratitude in the gesture. "Sometimes," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "it's the quiet moments that matter the most. Not the loud ones, not the dramatic ones, but the steady, honest moments that you remember years later." I nodded, taking a slow sip of the tea. "You're right," I said. I hadn't realized how much I'd been missing that the feeling of being understood, not just seen, but understood. He looked at me, his eyes holding that steady warmth, and for a moment it felt like time had slowed down. "You deserve that," he said. "More than anyone should have to ask for it." I felt a lump in my throat. It was rare for me to allow myself to feel so openly acknowledged, and the sincerity in his words made it almost impossible to contain the emotion welling up inside me. "Thank you," I whispered. "Truly." The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. We didn't need to fill the space with words. Sometimes presence alone was enough to communicate everything we had begun to understand about each other. By the time I left the office, the sky outside was painted in shades of